You can't miss out on this one as college campuses become the breeding ground for far-left ideologues being exported across the country. It's really a sight to see when someone like Michael Knowles goes straight into the hornet's nest to tell some hard-hitting truth. But as we've seen so far, there's no shortage of these college speaking events turned into violent screaming matches when the on-site student activists can no longer take the heat. That's exactly what Michael Knowles has had to deal with, so subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and let's get into it.
I was asked to give a speech in defense of George Washington at George Washington University. George Washington, one of the greatest men who ever lived, and specifically in this case, George the Colonial, who is the mascot of GW, as well as all of those colonials who gave this world and gave all of us this great nation. I think ignorance plays a major role here in the effort to get rid of GW's colonial mascot and moniker, George himself. The activists make a number of mistakes, not merely in their logic, but even in their grasp of basic facts. The first of which is to whom the word colonials refers. The colonials that the mascot represents were not defenders of colonialism. In fact, they were the opposite of defenders of colonialism. They fought a bloody war, they risked their lives to end colonialism in America and to end rule in Great Britain. They wanted their political independence.
You fascist! Shame! 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 Shame!
Oh, these kids are really proving me wrong. You see, because my premise was that these students are ignorant and not well behaved. But they're proving me wrong tonight. They called me a fascist for defending George Washington. Behold your country, leftists.
I've always wondered, do these young students disrupting speaking events like this purposefully make time for these events just to shout from the stands? Like whispering a count to 5 in unison and getting up at the same time? You'd have to be very far down the rabbit hole of your ideology to put in that much thought, and yet it's always in the wrong time since Michael Knowles was literally making a point against colonialism. But on the larger subject of that George Washington mascot controversy a couple years ago, he realized that what happened in this hall is really just a microcosm of the culture at large. It's a lethal combination of anger, ignorance, and arrogance that makes these young students, activists, act out in erratic ways. So here's the quick rundown of what happened back in 2018. Students at George Washington University called on the university president and administration to change the name of the George Washington mascot from colonials to something that would offend them less in the backdrop of America's history. But in the characteristic ignorance of how that word is even used, this statement read in part, quote, "We as students of the George Washington University believe it is of great exigence that the university changes its official mascot. The use of colonials, no matter how innocent the intention, is received as extremely offensive by not only students at the university but the nation and world at large. The historically negative charged figure of colonials has too deep a connection to colonization and glorifies the act of systematic oppression." But the word colonial does have different meanings, and in this case it didn't name the George Washington mascot colonial in the sense that it celebrated colonialism. But the George Washington was from the American colonies. You can take any other meaning or connotation from it if you know anything at all about George Washington himself. That name was eventually changed to Revolutionaries in 2022, which is actually a pretty good name. But apparently those ill-informed tirades didn't stop there. Michael Knowles had to have the security intervene for what happened next.
This creates ever-multiplying victim groups, false victim groups like these people. This creates ever-multiplying racial victims. I know, you're so oppressed, my dears. I know, life is so hard for you. You have to live in the richest, most equitable, most just country in the history of the world. You have to get a college education. You have to voluntarily go to lectures. It's so awful. I can't imagine that, the people who are in war-torn nations, they must truly pity you. Goodbye then. Well, it's very difficult to use my platform when people use the heckler's veto to try to shut up any opinion that disagrees. I didn't think I was this intimidating. That gentleman just threw paint on me. I gotta tell you, folks, I knew that this totally common sense statement was controversial. I didn't know it was this controversial. You're trying to teach me with your fists. Thank you. That's the same lesson that Mussolini was teaching people. You ridiculous fascists. You ridiculous, silly fascists. Goodness gracious. How am I ever going to get the glitter paint out of my clothing? Maybe it looks good, I don't know. How is this guy still in this lecture hall? How is this guy still in this university? It is outrageous. By the way, if these people are not expelled from this university, that is a scandal for the University of Missouri. It would be an absolute outrage if these people are not expelled from this university for acts of violence to protest the most common sense statement that I could possibly make, which is that men are not women. Imagine if I said something controversial here tonight. Imagine the reaction then.
Truly unbelievable, and it stems from the culture that construes speech as violence and disagreement as microaggression. When you've set up that foundation, actual violence becomes justified as a response. That's exactly what you saw play out, but there's something that the late Christopher Hitchens said that I always remember at a scene like this. It's that when a heckler is shouting down a speaker laying out ideas, he's not just trampling on the rights of that speaker, but also the right of his inner self to be exposed to new ideas. The heckler's also doing injustice to himself as much as he is to the speaker, because he's creating a wall that keeps himself in the dark as much as it hides him from ideas he doesn't want to hear. And a college or university of all places is the last one where this should happen, especially in the digital world we live in with our online lives, put in ideological bubbles. Thanks to algorithms, it's imperative that we actually seek out people that disagree with us, challenge us, and maybe even offend us. That's the only way to sharpen our minds instead of dulling the world around us. Unfortunately, it stems from a conflation between speech and violence that's all too common these days, and it became evident from this interaction next.
What do you support specifically? Do you think that anti-immigrant rhetoric is violent free speech?
Yes, because of the reasons
you think that speech is
about.
violence?
No, I think that
that's what that sign says.
The conversation that you're having is oppressive. And
so I am oppressing people by what I'm doing. So I am exerting violence on people by my speech. That's what the sign says, and that's what you just said.
It contributes to.
And the protester is saying that's exactly what I'm doing, and she's saying that's exactly what her sign means. So that means that you, a faculty member at an American public university, paid for by taxpayer dollars, are conflating speech with violence.
Yes. Speech can be violent. What you are saying contributes to systemic racism in this country. It means that my students of color are pulled over and accused of stealing a car when they did not.
I'm not pulling anybody over for stealing any cars.
I
see many people of many different races in this room. They all seem to be doing just fine. I don't think any of them have felt violence because they listened to a lecture on basic facts about our immigration system. The question was, have I asked people in this room if they've felt as though some violence has been committed on them? No, I haven't asked, because no violence has been committed on you. Because violence is not a subjective feeling. Violence is an objective fact. And I would say to you, as a faculty member at a taxpayer-funded university, this is the foundation of liberal education. If you cannot understand that there is a difference between speech and violence, you don't understand anything that undergirds the liberal arts or liberal education. And that is a real shame. And I say this with all respect and with great distress for our universities. If our teachers don't understand the difference between ideas and violence, between speech and violence, then they are in no position to educate the next generation of Americans.
That's only a sign of modern America that is woefully out of touch with the values and ideals that make it great. But fortunately, as long as there are people brave enough to go deep into the lion's den and dare to challenge the reigning orthodoxy, then the price of some heckling, shouting, and violent behavior is worth it for the sake of free speech. Let me know in the comments what you think, because I don't think there's any other way to keep open the walls of free speech in a culture where it's constantly under attack from people that think having your feelings protected is more important than hearing opposing ideas.